The dust rose in amber clouds as Victoria Reed's worn boots touched the platform, her lungs catching on air so dry it felt like breathing sand. She clutched her carpetbag tighter, scanning the faces of men who'd gathered to watch the afternoon train arrive in Marysvale, Utah, their curiosity sharp as the September sun beating down on her black traveling dress. Among them stood a man apart from the others, his hat low over eyes the color of storm clouds. And when their gazes met across 20 feet of weathered planks, something in her chest lurched like the train wheels finding purchase on new track. He didn't step forward immediately, this cowboy whose advertisement she'd answered 3 months prior from her boarding house room in Philadelphia. Kade Whitmore. The name had seemed solid on paper, promising in the careful script of his letters. He'd written of a ranch struggling back to life after years of drought, of mountain views and honest work, of needing a partner to share the burden and the beauty alike. Victoria had responded because the factory where she'd sewn shirts 12 hours a day had closed its doors, because her landlady was selling the building, because at 23 she'd watched too many women her age grow gray in tenement shadows waiting for lives that would never come. The other men began dispersing when Kade finally moved, his stride unhurried despite the weight of the moment. He stopped 3 feet away, and Victoria noticed the way his hands hung loose at his sides, unthreatening, careful. Up close, she could see the weathering of sun and wind on his face, the small scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the dusting of stubble that suggested he'd been working too hard to bother with a razor that morning. He looked maybe 28, though the West had a way of aging men faster than city life did. "Miss Reed," he said, and his voice carried the rough texture of someone unused to speaking much. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "It was long," Victoria answered, testing her own voice after days of sitting silent in train cars. "But I'm here now?" He nodded slowly as if considering the simple truth of that statement. Then his gaze dropped to her single bag. "This all you brought?" "All I own that matters." She didn't elaborate, didn't mention selling most of her possessions to afford the train ticket. How she'd left behind a city that had never felt like home, despite being born there. Something shifted in his expression, not quite pity, but understanding. He reached for her bag, and she let him take it, following as he led her toward a wagon hitched at the end of the platform. The horse was a roan gelding, well kept despite its age, and when Kade loaded her carpetbag into the wagon bed, he did so with the same careful precision that marked all his movements. "Ranch is about an hour north," he told her, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. His palm was calloused, warm despite the autumn weather beginning to cool the desert air. "We can stop at the general store first if you need supplies. Or, if you've changed your mind, I can take you to the boarding house. Mrs. Chen runs a respectable place. No obligation to go through with this if you're having doubts." Victoria settled onto the wooden seat. Smoothing her skirts, though, they were already hopelessly wrinkled. She met his eyes directly. "I didn't come all this way to stay in a boarding house, Mr. Whitmore, unless you're the one having doubts." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Fair enough." He climbed up beside her, taking the reins in capable hands. "And you can call me Kade. We're meant to be married come Sunday. Might as well use given names." "Kade," she repeated, letting the name settle on her tongue. "Then call me Victoria." He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward, pulling them away from the train station and into the dusty main street of Marysvale. The town was smaller than Victoria had imagined, just a handful of buildings clustered around the railroad tracks like chicks around a hen. She counted a general store, a saloon, what looked like a church with a crooked steeple, a blacksmith shop with its forge burning orange in the dimness. A few women in faded calico dresses watched from doorways, their expressions neutral, but their interest obvious. "Town's not much," Kade said, as if reading her thoughts. "Most folks live on ranches or in the mining camps up in the Tusher Mountains. But there's a circuit preacher who comes through first Sunday of each month. That's 3 days from now." Victoria nodded, doing the arithmetic in her head. 3 days living as strangers before becoming husband and wife. The arrangement felt both rushed and interminable. "Your letters mentioned you run cattle." "Some cattle, mostly horses now. Drought hit the valley hard 5 years back. Lot of ranchers lost everything. My father built our place up near Butte Creek, where the water runs year-round from snowmelt. We had enough to survive, but not enough to keep hired hands. Been working it myself since my father passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss." Kade's jaw tightened briefly. He was a hard man, but a fair one. Taught me everything about working the land. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I should tell you straight that ranch life is harder than anything you've known in the city. The work never stops, and there's no neighbors close by if you need help. Winters get cold enough to freeze water in the pipes. Summer sun bakes everything brown. If you're expecting comfort, you'll be disappointed. I'm not expecting comfort, Victoria said quietly. I'm expecting a chance. They rode in silence after that, leaving the town behind as the wagon track curved northward through scrubland dotted with sage and juniper. The valley spread wide around them, rimmed by mountains that rose like ramparts against the endless blue sky. Victoria had never seen so much open space, had never understood how the horizon could feel, both liberating and terrifying, in equal measure. Back in Philadelphia, buildings pressed close enough to block the sun for hours at a time. Here, light poured down unfiltered, revealing every detail of the landscape in sharp relief. It's beautiful, she said finally, surprising herself with the truth of it. Kade glanced at her, and this time his expression softened into something almost vulnerable. I think so too. Some folks see nothing but hard ground and harder work. But on mornings when the light hits the peaks just right, or when the aspens turn gold in September, I can't imagine living anywhere else. Is that why you stayed after your father died? You could have sold the ranch, moved somewhere easier. Thought about it, he admitted. But this land, it gets into your blood. My father came here in '65, right after the Civil War ended, built everything from nothing. Selling felt like giving up on his memory, on everything he worked for. Victoria heard the weight of duty in his words, understood it in a way she hadn't expected. Her own father had worked himself to death in a textile mill, her mother following him 6 months later from grief and exhaustion. She'd promised herself she wouldn't repeat their mistakes, wouldn't let the world grind her down into dust. Coming west had been about escape as much as opportunity, about choosing a different kind of hardship on her own terms. The wagon crested a rise and the ranch came into view below, nestled in a fold of land where a creek cut silver through the brown earth. The house was small but sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A barn stood behind it, flanked by several corrals where horses grazed in the afternoon light. Victoria counted 8 animals, their coats gleaming like polished copper and coal. Beyond the barn, the land rolled away toward the mountains, sectioned by split-rail fencing that marked the boundaries of Kade's property. It's not much, Kade said again, and Victoria heard the uncertainty beneath his words, the question he wasn't asking. It's more than I've ever had, she answered honestly. In the tenement where she'd grown up, 6 families had shared a single privy. The boarding house room she'd left behind measured maybe 8 feet square. This ranch, small as it might be by Western standards, represented space and possibility beyond anything she'd known. Kade drove the wagon down to the house and set the brake, tying off the reins before jumping down. He came around to help Victoria descend, and again she noticed the careful distance he maintained, the respect in how he waited for her to accept his hand, rather than presuming. The dust settled around them as they stood by the wagon, the only sounds the soft nickering of horses and the distant rush of creek water. I fixed up the bedroom for you, Kade said, reaching for her carpetbag. I've been sleeping in the barn since I knew you were coming. Figure we'll maintain that arrangement until after the wedding, if that suits you. Relief and something else, something harder to name, washed through Victoria. That's very proper of you. Like I said in my letters, I'm looking for a partner, not a servant. This has to be a choice we both make freely. He started toward the house, and Victoria followed, her legs stiff from hours of travel. The front door opened directly into a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor all in one. The furniture was sparse but solid, a table with 4 mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with tin plates and cups. Someone had swept recently, and wildflowers wilted in a jar on the table, a gesture that made Victoria's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Did you pick those?" she asked, nodding toward the flowers. Color rose in Kade's weathered cheeks. "Thought they might make the place more welcoming. They're pretty much dead now, though. I cut them 3 days back when I thought you'd be arriving sooner. They're still nice." The thought was kind. He set her bag down near a door that presumably led to the bedroom. "There's a pump out back for water, and the privy is past the barn. I keep the stove stocked with wood. Kitchen supplies are basic, but there's enough to make supper. I usually eat simple, just beans and bacon mostly. But I figure you'll have your own ideas about cooking. Victoria moved to the window, looking out at the creek and the mountains beyond. The glass was clean, letting in streams of golden afternoon light. In Philadelphia, I worked in a factory. Before that, I cleaned houses. I never had much chance to learn fancy cooking, but I can make a meal stretch and keep a home running. My mother taught me that much before she passed. When did you lose her? 4 years ago. My father went first, then her. Victoria turned back to face him. After that, it was just me. No siblings, no close family. So, when your advertisement appeared in the newspaper, it seemed like fate offering a door I'd been looking for. Kade leaned against the table, arms crossed but posture open. I won't lie and say I've got dozens of women wanting to marry me. Marysvale isn't exactly overflowing with prospects, and most folks around here already know each other from childhood. I thought about courting Sally Chen, the boarding house owner's daughter, but she's set on marrying a mining engineer from Beaver. Putting an advertisement felt desperate, but staying alone felt worse. Why worse? Victoria asked, curious about this taciturn man who seemed to measure every word before speaking. Because ranching alone is killing me slowly. There's too much work for one person, and coming back to an empty house every night makes you forget why you're working so hard in the first place. I want someone to build something with, someone to share the good days and weather the bad ones alongside. My parents had that kind of partnership. Figured I might find it too, even if the circumstances are unusual. The honesty in his voice reached something deep in Victoria's chest. She'd expected practical explanations, perhaps even cold calculations about needing help with domestic labor. This vulnerability, this admission of loneliness, felt like a gift of trust. I want that too, she said softly. I want a home that's mine, work that matters, someone who sees me as more than just extra hands. If we can build that together, then I think we might make something good here. Kade met her eyes and held them, and in that moment, Victoria felt the strange weight of possibility settling over them both. This man was offering shelter not just from the elements, but from the grinding anonymity of city life, from the exhaustion of surviving without ever truly living. Whether she could offer him something equally valuable remained to be seen, but she was determined to try. I should show you around before dark, Kade said, pushing away from the table. Get you familiar with the layout. Tomorrow, I'll teach you about the horses if you're interested. And we'll need to go back into town Saturday to meet with Preacher Morrison, make sure everything's ready for Sunday. Victoria nodded, following him back outside as he led her on a tour of the property. He showed her the barn, where 8 horses had their stalls, explaining that he bred working stock for sale to ranchers throughout the territory. The animals were his pride. She could tell by the way he ran his hands along their necks, checking them over with practiced ease. He introduced each horse by name and temperament. Sage, the lead mare who bossed the others around. Thunder, a young stallion still learning manners. Bella and Whiskey and Copper and the rest, each with their own personality that Kade recited like reading chapters from a favorite book. The cattle are up in the summer pasture still, he explained as they walked the fence line toward the creek. I'll bring them down in a few weeks when the weather turns. Only got about 30 head left, enough to provide beef for us and some to sell. The real money is in the horses, though. A good working horse can fetch $80, and I usually sell 4 or 5 a year after training them proper. You train them yourself? My father taught me. It takes patience more than anything, convincing them to trust you instead of forcing compliance. Broke horses don't work as well as ones that choose to partner with you. Victoria heard the parallel to their own situation, but didn't comment on it. Instead, she knelt by the creek, dipping her fingers in water so cold it made her gasp. This never dries up. Not in living memory. Comes down from snowpack high in the Tushers. That's why this ranch survived when others failed. Kade squatted beside her, watching the water rush over smooth stones. In summer, neighbors come asking to water their stock here. My father always said yes, figured the creek was God's gift, not ours to hoard. I've kept that policy. That's generous, especially in drought years. It's survival. You help your neighbors, they help you back when you need it. That's how community works out here, even when folks live miles apart. They returned to the house as the sun began its descent, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Kade showed Victoria the bedroom, a simple space with an iron bedstead covered in a star-patterned quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window looking toward the peaks. Her carpet bag sat at the foot of the bed, looking small and lost. "I'll leave you to settle in," Kade said from the doorway. "There's water in the pitcher for washing. Come out when you're ready and I'll get supper started." Victoria spent a few minutes unpacking her meager belongings. 3 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a shawl her mother had knitted, a small Bible with her family names recorded in the front cover, a daguerreotype of her parents taken before hardship had worn them down. She arranged them carefully in the dresser, claiming this space as her own, even as uncertainty thrummed beneath her breastbone. When she emerged, she found Kade at the stove, frying bacon, a pot of beans warming beside it. He'd set out 2 plates and was slicing bread from a loaf that looked purchased rather than homemade. "Not much of a cook," he admitted when he noticed her watching. "I can manage basics, but anything fancier is beyond me." "This is fine," Victoria said, and meant it. She'd gone hungry enough nights in Philadelphia that any meal looked like bounty. They sat across from each other at the table, serving themselves in the comfortable silence. The food was plain but filling, and Victoria ate with an appetite sharpened by travel and fresh air. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Kade said eventually. "What was it like, growing up there?" Victoria considered the question, searching for words to bridge the vast gap between his experience and hers. "Crowded, noisy. Everything pressed together so tight you could hear your neighbors arguing through the walls. The streets smelled like coal smoke and horses, and too many people in too little space. But there were moments of beauty, too. Street vendors selling roasted chestnuts in winter. The flower market in spring. Italian women hanging laundry like flags from fire escapes. It wasn't all bad, just hard in ways that wore you down without noticing until one day you realized you'd forgotten what fresh air tasted like." Kade listened intently, his storm-gray eyes focused on her face. "Think you'll miss it?" "No," Victoria answered without hesitation. "I'll miss nothing about it except maybe the ocean. I saw it once, took the trolley out to the coast on my one day off. The waves were bigger than I'd imagined, powerful enough to erase everything. I think that's what I came west looking for. Not the ocean exactly, but that same sense of something vast enough to make your problems feel smaller." "Mountains do that," Kade said quietly. "Make you realize how little you are, but somehow that feels comforting instead of frightening. Like you're part of something bigger than just your own struggles." They finished eating, and Victoria insisted on washing the dishes, needing activity to work out the strange energy that came from sitting across from this man who was supposed to become her husband in 3 days. Kade dried them with a threadbare towel, establishing an easy rhythm between them. When everything was clean and put away, awkwardness descended as they both realized the evening stretched ahead with no clear structure. "I usually read a bit before bed," Kade offered. "Got some books if you want to borrow one. Not a big collection, just what I've accumulated." He showed her a small shelf beside the fireplace, where maybe 24 volumes leaned against each other. Victoria scanned the titles: agricultural manuals, a battered copy of Ivanhoe, some volumes of poetry by Longfellow and Whitman, a history of the Utah Territory. She selected the poetry, thinking it might occupy her mind without requiring too much concentration. They sat in the dimming light, Kade in a chair by the window, with a book about horse breeding, Victoria on the bench near the cold fireplace with the poetry. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus, and the last of the day's heat radiated from the log walls. It felt unexpectedly peaceful, this quiet companionship, and Victoria found herself relaxing into it, despite all the uncertainties ahead. When full dark arrived, Kade lit a kerosene lamp and stood, stretching his back with an audible crack. "I'll head out to the barn, let you have privacy for the evening. Bar the door if it makes you feel safer. I'll knock in the morning before coming in." "Kade," Victoria said as he reached for his hat. He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for being patient with all this, for treating me with respect instead of just as something you purchased." His expression hardened slightly. "You're not property, Victoria. The money I sent for your train ticket was an investment in our mutual future, not a transaction. Don't ever think of yourself as bought." The fierceness in his voice surprised her, revealed depths she was just beginning to understand. "I'll try to remember that." He nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Victoria sat for a moment longer, then rose to bar the door as he'd suggested, not from fear but from the ingrained habit of city living. She washed using the cold water from the pitcher, changed into her nightgown, and slipped between sheets that smelled of lye soap and sunshine. The mattress was corn husk, crackling softly under her weight, comfortable enough after days of sleeping, sitting up on trains. Through the window, she could see stars multiplying across the black sky, more stars than she'd known existed. In Philadelphia, coal smoke and city lights obscured all but the brightest celestial bodies. Here, the Milky Way spread like spilled milk across the heavens, so dense with light she could almost read by it. The sight made her feel simultaneously insignificant and blessed, exactly as Kade had described. Sleep came easier than expected, her exhausted body surrendering to the deep quiet of the countryside. Morning arrived with rooster crow and golden light streaming through the window. Victoria woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where she was, until memory returned with the weight of her new reality. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a faded blue calico, and unbarred the door. Outside she could hear Kade moving around, the sound of the axe splitting wood for the stove. She found the privy where he'd indicated, then washed at the pump behind the house, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. When she returned inside, Kade was at the stove starting coffee, his hair damp as though he'd washed at the same pump. "Morning," he greeted. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months, actually. The quiet takes some getting used to after years of city noise." "I imagine it does." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handing her one. "I thought today I'd teach you about the horses like I mentioned. If we're going to run this ranch together, you should know how to handle them, at least the basics. That work for you?" Victoria wrapped her hands around the warm cup, savoring the bitter smell of the coffee. "I've never been around horses much. The trolley horses in Philadelphia, but never up close. These are gentler than city horses, working animals but treated well, so they're calm around people. I won't put you with the stallion yet, but the mares are good teachers." They ate a quick breakfast of fried eggs and leftover bread, then headed to the barn where the horses were already stamping impatiently for their morning feeding. Kade handed Victoria a bucket of grain and showed her how to portion it out into each stall's feed box, explaining the personalities and quirks of each animal as they went. Sage, the lead mare, nuzzled Victoria's shoulder with a soft nose, searching for treats. "She likes you," Kade observed. "Horses are good judges of character. They can sense nervousness or aggression, but also kindness. You've got a gentle way about you that they respond to." Victoria tentatively stroked Sage's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal through her coat, the solid muscle and living presence. "She's beautiful. They all are." "Wait here," Kade said, disappearing into the tack room. He emerged with a saddle and bridle. "I'm going to teach you to ride. Can't live on a ranch and not know how to handle a horse." The next hours passed in concentrated instruction as Kade walked Victoria through the basics. How to approach a horse, how to saddle and bridle properly, how to mount from the left side, how to hold the reins and communicate with pressure and release. He chose Bella, an older mare with a patient disposition, for Victoria's first ride. Sitting atop the horse felt terrifyingly high at first, the ground far below, and the animal's every movement transmitting through Victoria's legs and spine. But Kade kept a hand on the bridle, walking beside them as they circled the corral, his voice steady and encouraging. "Relax your shoulders. Let yourself move with her instead of fighting the motion. That's it. You're getting the feel of it. Horses respond to confidence, not force. You're doing well." By the time the sun reached its zenith, Victoria could walk and halt Bella on her own, could steer in basic patterns around the corral. Her legs trembled from gripping the saddle, and her lower back ached, but pride burned bright in her chest. She'd learned something completely new, proven to herself she could adapt to this foreign landscape. "Enough for today," Kade said, helping her dismount. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "You'll be sore tonight, but it passes. Tomorrow will go a bit longer." They unsaddled Bella together, Kade showing Victoria how to brush down the mare and check her hooves for stones. The work was meditative, rhythmic, and Victoria found herself enjoying the simple act of caring for the animal. Sage watched from her stall with intelligent eyes, and Thunder nickered jealously from his pen, demanding attention. "You're a demanding boy," Kade told the young stallion, producing an apple from his pocket and feeding it to the horse in pieces. "Your turn will come." They returned to the house for a midday meal, and Victoria insisted on cooking this time, making a simple stew from beef jerky, potatoes from the root cellar, and carrots that were starting to look soft, but were still edible. It was basic fare but hot and nourishing, and Cade complimented it with sincere appreciation. "Haven't had a proper stew in ages," he said. "Usually I just eat things cold or barely heated. This is real cooking. Wait until I get a better sense of your supplies, and I can plan proper meals. This was just throwing together what I found. It's still more than I've managed in 2 years." After eating, Victoria insisted on exploring the root cellar and pantry, taking mental inventory of what Cade had in stock. She found he'd laid in good supplies for winter: sacks of flour and cornmeal, dried beans, preserved fruits in jars that looked store-bought, coffee, sugar, salt pork, and molasses. With these basics and fresh meat from hunting or butchering, she could keep them fed through the cold months ahead. The afternoon was spent on ranch tasks, Cade showing Victoria how to collect eggs from the small chicken coop behind the barn, how to draw water from the well and carry it without slopping, how to bank the stove fire so it would last longer. Everything was new knowledge, skills she'd never needed in the city where water came from a pump in the street and eggs were purchased from vendors. "You're a quick learner," Cade commented as they worked. "Some folks from back east come out here expecting things to be like home, then get frustrated when nothing works the way they're used to. You're adapting." "I don't have much choice," Victoria said honestly. "This is my life now. Might as well learn to live it properly." "It's more than necessity, though. You could be resentful or resistant. Instead, you're engaging with everything. That matters." His words warmed her more than they probably should have. She'd been so long without anyone noticing her efforts, without appreciation for simply doing what needed doing. Cade saw her in a way that the factory foremen and boarding house matrons never had, as a person with her own thoughts and abilities rather than just a body to perform labor. Evening came again, bringing its soft light and cooling air. They made supper together this time, Victoria frying potatoes, while Cade grilled steaks from beef he brought up from the cold storage. They ate on the front porch, sitting on the steps and watching the shadows lengthen across the valley. In the distance, a coyote called and was answered by another, the wild sound raising goosebumps on Victoria's arms. "Takes getting used to, the animal sounds at night," Cade said. "Coyotes, owls, sometimes a mountain lion screaming like a woman in distress. It's just nature, though. Nothing to fear as long as you're inside." "Do you ever feel lonely out here?" Victoria asked. "Before you sent for me, I mean. Did the isolation bother you?" Cade was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes, especially winter when the snow gets deep and you might not see another person for weeks. I'd go into town on supply runs and find myself talking too much to the shopkeeper, using up my words like I had a quota to meet. But loneliness and solitude are different things. I like the solitude, the space to think. It's the loneliness, the lack of someone to share things with, that wore on me. I understand that. In Philadelphia, I was surrounded by people constantly, but still felt alone. Seems like loneliness has less to do with how many people are around, and more about whether anyone truly sees you." "That's it exactly." Cade turned to look at her, the last light catching in his gray eyes. "These past 2 days, talking with you, teaching you about the ranch, it's reminded me what I was missing. Not just help with the work, but companionship. Someone to share the day with at the end of it." Victoria's heart beat faster in her chest. "I feel that too. This is all so strange and new, but there's something right about it as well. Like, I'm finally where I'm supposed to be, even though I didn't know I was looking for it until your advertisement appeared." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began appearing overhead. That same magnificent display Victoria had marveled at the night before. Tomorrow, they would ride into town to meet with the preacher, to make the final arrangements for Sunday's wedding. The thought should have terrified her, marrying a man she'd known for barely 2 days. Instead, she felt a curious calm, a sense of pieces falling into alignment. Saturday morning dawned cooler, the first real hint of autumn sharpening the air. Victoria dressed in her best remaining dress, a gray wool that was too warm for the day, but appropriate for meeting a preacher. Cade wore clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his hair combed back with water, his jaw freshly shaved. He looked younger without the stubble, and Victoria realized he was probably only 27 or 28, not much older than herself. The ride into Marysvale took the same hour it had 2 days before, but this time Victoria felt more attuned to the landscape, noticing details she'd missed in her initial overwhelm. She saw how the sage grew in patterns following underground water, how the mountains changed color as clouds passed overhead, how different sections of land showed the marks of previous homesteaders who'd failed and moved on, leaving only foundation stones and broken fences behind. "This valley's seen a lot of dreams die," Kade said when he noticed her looking at an abandoned cabin. "In the 70s, during the silver boom, people flooded into Utah thinking they'd strike it rich. Most of them gave up after a few years when the easy silver was gone and ranching proved harder than expected. The ones who stayed were the stubborn ones, the ones who loved the land more than they loved comfort." "Like your father, like my father," Kade agreed. "He used to say that the land tests you, and if you can't pass the test, it's better to learn that early and go back east where you belong. Harsh philosophy, but there's truth to it. This country doesn't forgive mistakes." They reached Marysvale just before noon, tying the wagon outside the general store. The church with its crooked steeple stood at the far end of the street, small but sturdy. Kade helped Victoria down from the wagon seat, and together they walked toward the building. Preacher Morrison turned out to be a rail-thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a Missouri accent. He welcomed them into the church, which was really just one room, with rough benches and a simple wooden cross mounted on the front wall. Sunlight streamed through the wavy glass windows, making patterns on the floor. "Kade Whitmore," the preacher said warmly, shaking Kade's hand. "Been a while since I've seen you in town, and this must be your intended bride?" "Victoria Reed, sir," Victoria said, accepting the preacher's handshake. His grip was firm, but gentle. "From Philadelphia," Kade told me in his letter. "That's quite a journey you've made, young lady. I hope you're finding Utah to your liking." "It's very different from what I knew, but beautiful in its own way. And Kade has been very welcoming." Preacher Morrison smiled. "That's good to hear. Now, I understand you two wish to be married tomorrow after services. I've got no objections to that. But I do need to ask you both some questions. Make sure you're entering into this union with proper understanding and intent." What followed was a gentle but thorough interview about their expectations for marriage, their understanding of its permanence, their willingness to support each other through hardship. Victoria answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging that theirs was an unconventional courtship, but insisting that she came freely and with serious intent. Kade's answers echoed her own, emphasizing his desire for partnership and his commitment to treating Victoria with respect. "Marriage is work," Preacher Morrison said when he'd finished his questions. "It's waking up every day and choosing each other again, especially when times are hard. The romantic feelings are wonderful, but they're not enough by themselves. You need friendship, respect, shared purpose. From what I'm hearing, you two have a foundation to build on. The rest will come with time and effort." "We understand," Kade said, and Victoria nodded her agreement. "Then I'll see you both tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Services start at 9, so plan to arrive a few minutes before that. You'll want witnesses, so I'll ask the Matsudas to stand up for you. Good people. They run the boarding house and restaurant." They thanked the preacher and left the church, stepping back into the bright midday sun. Marysvale's single street bustled with Saturday activity. Ranchers coming in for supplies, miners from the camps spending their wages at the saloon. A few people nodded greetings to Kade, their curious gazes lingering on Victoria. "Should we get supplies while we're here?" Victoria asked. "I noticed you're low on sugar, and we'll need more coffee soon." Kade looked pleased that she'd paid attention to the pantry inventory. "Good idea. Let me introduce you to Frank Yang. He runs the general store. Decent man, fair prices." The store was dimly lit after the brightness outside, crammed with merchandise from floor to ceiling. Barrels of flour and crackers lined one wall. Shelves held everything from lamp oil to tobacco to bolts of fabric. Behind the counter stood a Chinese man, maybe 40 years old, his queue neatly braided, his expression welcoming. "Kade Whitmore," he greeted. "And this must be the bride everyone's been talking about. Welcome to Marysvale, Miss Reed. I'm Frank Yang, and if there's anything you need that I don't have in stock, I can order it on the next supply train." "Thank you, Mr. Yang. I'm Victoria. Pleased to meet you." They spent the next 30 minutes selecting supplies, Victoria adding items Kade wouldn't have thought of: baking powder, dried fruit, needles, and thread, a packet of vegetable seeds for next spring's garden. Frank wrapped everything carefully in brown paper, keeping a running tally in a ledger. When Kade paid, Victoria noticed the amount was less than she'd expected, and she suspected Frank had given them a wedding discount, but was too tactful to mention it. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, a woman emerged from the building next door, which bore a sign reading Chin's Boarding House and Restaurant. She was perhaps 25, pretty in a practical way, with her black hair pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet. Her gaze went immediately to Cade, and Victoria saw something complicated flash across her features before settling into polite neutrality. "Sally," Cade said, his voice carefully even. "Good to see you. This is Victoria Reed, my fiancée. Victoria, Sally Chen. Her parents run the boarding house." "Congratulations," Sally said, and to her credit, she sounded sincere, despite whatever complicated feelings might lurk beneath. "I hope you'll be very happy together. It's good that Cade won't be alone on that ranch anymore. He works too hard." "Thank you," Victoria said, uncertain how to navigate this interaction with a woman who clearly had some history with Cade, even if just as a possibility that never materialized. "I heard you're marrying Samuel Preston," Cade said. "The mining engineer from Beaver. Your parents must be pleased." "They are. Samuel's a good man, steady work. We're planning a spring wedding." Sally's smile was genuine now, talking about her own situation. "I hope you'll both come when the time arrives." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before parting, and as Cade guided the wagon back toward the ranch, Victoria wrestled with unexpected feelings. Jealousy seemed absurd given the circumstances, yet seeing Sally look at Cade had stirred something protective in her chest. "You considered courting her," Victoria said, not quite a question. "Briefly, but it was clear her heart was set elsewhere, and mine wasn't really in it. I think we both would have been settling, and that didn't seem fair to either of us." Cade glanced at Victoria. "If you're worried there's unfinished business there, don't be. Sally's a nice woman, but there was never anything between us beyond friendly acquaintance." "I believe you, just trying to understand where I fit in the community here, what relationships already exist. Most folks will be curious about you, might be a bit standoffish until they get to know you. Small towns are like that, cautious about outsiders. But if you're fair and friendly, they'll come around. And being my wife will give you a place here, ties you into the web of relationships that make up this valley." The ride home passed in comfortable conversation, Cade pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the area's history. Victoria learned about the Ute tribe that had originally claimed this valley, how conflicts with Mormon settlers had led to their forced removal to reservations. Cade spoke carefully about this history, not excusing the injustices, but not dwelling on them either, simply acknowledging the complicated reality of how the West had been won and who had paid the price. "My father respected the Ute," Cade said, "learned some of their ways of reading weather and tracking game. When the last of them were being removed, he tried to help however he could, shared water and supplies. Didn't make much difference in the end, but he felt it mattered to try." Victoria thought about the waves of displacement and struggle that had created the world she now inhabited, how her own fresh start was built on land, claimed through violence and loss. It complicated her sense of finding home here, added layers of moral weight to what had seemed like a simple personal decision. But life, she was learning, was never simple once you looked beneath the surface. They arrived back at the ranch in late afternoon, unloading supplies and tending to the horses before making supper. The evening felt different from previous ones, weighted with anticipation of tomorrow's ceremony. They were both quieter, caught in their own thoughts about the permanence they were about to embrace. "Are you nervous?" Cade asked as they washed dishes after eating. "Yes," Victoria admitted, "but not in a bad way, more like standing at the edge of something, knowing once you jump, there's no going back." "I feel that too. It's a bigger leap than I expected when I first wrote that advertisement. You've become real to me these past days, not just an idea of companionship, but an actual person with thoughts and feelings. That makes the commitment more serious somehow." Victoria set down the plate she was drying, turning to face him directly. "Cade, I need you to know that I'm choosing this freely, not because I'm desperate, though I was, but because in these few days you've shown me more respect and kindness than I've known in years. I think we can make a good life together if we're both willing to try." He met her eyes, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "I'm willing to try, Victoria. More than willing. Tomorrow when we speak those vows, I'll mean every word." The moment stretched between them, charged with potential, and Victoria realized that somewhere in the past 3 days, she'd begun falling for this quiet cowboy with his careful ways and storm-gray eyes. It wasn't the passionate lightning strike of romantic stories, but something steadier, like creek water wearing smooth stones into beauty over time. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear, the sky that infinite blue that only high desert country could produce. Victoria woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep longer. She put on her best dress, the one she'd worn on the train, and attempted to tame her hair into something presentable. She had no jewelry except her mother's simple locket, which she fastened around her neck for luck. Kade knocked precisely at 7, giving them plenty of time to reach town. When Victoria opened the door, she found him in a suit that had clearly been stored away for years, but still fit his shoulders well. He'd shaved carefully and slicked his hair back, and the formality transformed him into someone almost unfamiliar until she noticed his eyes, those same gray eyes that had promised shelter 3 days ago on the train platform. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the honesty in his voice made Victoria's cheeks warm. "You clean up well yourself," she replied, trying for lightness to ease her nerves. The wagon ride into town felt both endless and far too short. Neither of them spoke much, saving their words for the vows they would soon exchange. Marysvale came into view with its crooked church steeple pointing toward heaven, and Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. They arrived with minutes to spare before services began. Already a few dozen people had gathered, ranchers and their families dressed in their Sunday best, miners still looking uncomfortable in clean clothes. Preacher Morrison greeted them at the door, introducing them to the witnesses he'd arranged, Mr. and Mrs. Matsuda, middle-aged Japanese immigrants who ran a small restaurant near the boarding house. They smiled warmly at Victoria, Mrs. Matsuda pressing a small bouquet of wildflowers into her hands. "For luck," she said in accented English. "New beginnings deserve flowers." The service itself passed in a blur of hymns and scripture readings. Victoria tried to focus on the preacher's words about community and faith, but her awareness kept returning to Kade sitting beside her on the hard bench, his presence solid and real. When Preacher Morrison finally called them forward to stand before the congregation, Victoria's legs trembled as she rose. They faced each other in front of the simple wooden cross, hands joined. The preacher's voice carried clearly in the small space as he spoke about the seriousness of marriage, about covenant and commitment. Then came the vows, the words Victoria had heard at other weddings, but never imagined speaking herself. "Do you, Kade Whitmore, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Kade said, his voice steady and sure, his eyes locked on Victoria's. "And do you, Victoria Reed, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Victoria whispered, then cleared her throat and repeated it louder. "I do. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Utah, and by God Almighty, I pronounce you husband and wife. Kade, you may kiss your bride." Kade leaned in slowly, giving Victoria time to close her eyes before his lips brushed hers in the gentlest possible kiss, respectful even in this sanctioned intimacy. It lasted only a moment, but Victoria felt it reverberate through her entire body, the sealing of promises made. The congregation applauded as they turned to face the community as husband and wife. Victoria recognized Frank Yang from the general store, Sally Chen sitting with a well-dressed man who must be her Samuel, various ranchers whose faces she'd seen around town. These were her neighbors now, her people, the web of relationships Kade had described. After the service, folks lined up to offer congratulations and welcome Victoria to the valley. Mrs. Matsuda had brought a small wedding cake from her restaurant, which was shared among everyone present. People pressed small gifts into their hands, a jar of preserves, a sack of apples, a hand-carved wooden spoon. The generosity moved Victoria nearly to tears, these near strangers celebrating their union with genuine warmth. Finally, they were able to escape to the wagon, supplies and gifts loaded in the back. As Kade drove them home, his new wedding ring catching the sunlight, Victoria processed the reality that she was now Mrs. Victoria Whitmore, that the ranch was as much hers as his, that the man beside her was her husband-in-law, and in the eyes of God. "How are you feeling?" Kade asked as they left town behind. "Married," Victoria said, which made them both laugh, breaking the tension. "Strange but good. You?" Same, it doesn't feel quite real yet, but I suppose it will in time. He paused, seeming to gather courage. About tonight, I want you to know there's no pressure. We can continue as we have been, taking our time to get comfortable with each other. Victoria appreciated his consideration, even as she felt something bolder rising in her chest. Kade, we're married now, properly married. I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not a child who needs protecting from the realities of marriage. When the time feels right, we'll know. His ears reddened, but he nodded. All right then, we'll let things unfold naturally. They spent the afternoon working side by side, the normalcy of ranch chores grounding them after the morning's ceremony. Victoria collected eggs while Kade tended the horses. She made supper from the supplies they had bought, attempting a better meal to mark the occasion. Chicken roasted with herbs she'd found growing near the creek, potatoes mashed with butter, carrots glazed with some of the precious sugar. Kade complimented every bite, and they ate by lamplight at the table that was now as much hers as his. After dishes were washed and put away, they stood in the main room facing each other, the weight of the evening and what it implied hanging between them. I should tell you, Victoria said quietly, that I don't know much about what happens between husband and wife. My mother died before she could explain those things, and the other women at the factory were crude about it in ways that didn't teach much. Kade's expression softened. We'll figure it out together. The important part is that we're partners in this, that what happens between us is about more than just obligation. I want you to feel safe with me, always. Victoria stepped closer, close enough to place her palm against his chest and feel his heart beating strong beneath the fabric. I do feel safe with you. That's why I can do this. She rose on her toes and kissed him, more than the chaste brush of lips at the ceremony. Kade's arms came around her carefully, pulling her closer, but still gentle, still offering her control of the pace. The kiss deepened gradually, a conversation without words about trust and desire and the promise of intimacy to come. When they finally parted, both breathing harder, Kade rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure? I'm sure. He took her hand and led her to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind them. What passed between them that night was private and sacred, an awkward but earnest exploration that became the foundation of their physical intimacy. They learned each other slowly, with patience and occasional laughter when things didn't go quite as expected. And when they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, Victoria felt the last of her old life falling away. She was transformed, remade into someone new through the alchemy of choice and commitment. The weeks that followed established the rhythm of their married life. Victoria threw herself into learning everything about ranching, proving herself capable with both domestic tasks and outdoor work. She mastered riding well enough to help Kade move the cattle down from summer pasture, sitting in the saddle for hours despite her protesting muscles. Together, they brought the small herd into the near corrals where they could be watched more easily through winter. She learned to milk the cow Kade had somehow neglected to mention owning, a placid animal named Clover, who provided fresh milk and butter. She planted a winter garden of hardy greens in a protected spot near the house. She mended Kade's worn clothing and sewed new curtains for the windows from fabric Frank Yang sold her at a discount. The house began feeling like a home, warm and lived in, filled with small touches that reflected her presence. Kade taught her to shoot his rifle, insisting she needed to protect herself if danger came while he was working far from the house. Victoria proved a decent shot after practicing, able to hit targets at 50 yards consistently. They hunted deer together before the deep snows came, Victoria learning to field dress the kill despite her initial squeamishness. The venison hung in the cold storage, insurance against winter hunger. In the evenings, they read together or played cards or simply talked, sharing stories from their separate pasts and dreams for their joined future. Kade spoke of expanding the horse breeding operation, of building up a reputation that would let him charge premium prices. Victoria talked about putting in a real vegetable garden come spring, preserving enough food that they wouldn't need to buy so much at the store. They were building something together, piece by piece, conversation by conversation. As October turned to November, the first snows dusted the peaks and cold settled into the valley. They worked to prepare the ranch for winter, repairing fence lines and stocking the barn with hay for the horses, chopping firewood until they had enough to see them through to spring. The work was endless but satisfying, especially when done side by side. One night as they lay together in the darkness, Cade's arm around her shoulders, Victoria said, "I never thanked you properly for answering my letter, for choosing me when you could have picked someone else." "There were only 3 responses to my advertisement," Cade admitted. "One woman wanted me to send money for her to travel around first, see other options. Another was 56 and said she needed a home for her 6 children from previous marriages. You were the only one who seemed like someone I could actually build a life with." Victoria laughed softly. "So I won by default?" "No. You won because your letter was honest. You didn't pretend to be something you weren't, or make promises you couldn't keep. You said you were hardworking, practical, and willing to learn, that you wanted a partnership, not a rescue. I respected that. And now, are you glad you chose me?" Cade shifted to look at her in the moonlight, streaming through the window. "Victoria, these past months have been the happiest I've been since my father died. Maybe even before that. You've brought life back to this place, made it feel like more than just work and survival. So, yes, I'm glad. More than glad." She kissed him then, pouring into the gesture all the feelings that words couldn't quite capture. What had started as a practical arrangement had transformed into something deeper, something that felt suspiciously like love, though neither of them had spoken that word yet. It hung between them, waiting for the right moment to be claimed. Winter arrived in earnest in December, bringing snows that piled up past the windows and temperatures that made Victoria grateful for the thick log walls and the stove burning day and night. They were snowed in for days at a time, the world reduced to their small homestead and the white wilderness beyond. Far from feeling trapped, Victoria found these enforced intimacies comforting. They had nowhere to be, nothing to do but tend the animals and keep each other warm. On Christmas Eve, they made a small celebration with what they had. Victoria baked a dried apple pie, and they roasted a chicken, saving some of their dwindling coffee for the occasion. They had no gifts for each other, having planned nothing, but Cade surprised her by pulling out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I ordered it from Frank Yang's catalog," he said, almost shy. "Been waiting to give it to you." Inside was a simple gold locket on a delicate chain, nothing fancy but beautifully made. Victoria's eyes stung with tears as she opened it to find 2 empty frames for photographs, or lock of hair. "We'll fill it together," Cade said. "Our family, whoever that becomes." "It's perfect," Victoria whispered, fastening it around her neck beside her mother's old one. "I didn't get you anything, though. I should have thought of it. You've given me everything that matters. A home instead of just a house. Company instead of loneliness. Purpose beyond just survival. That's gift enough." They made love that night, with a tenderness that had been slowly building since their wedding night, the awkwardness long since replaced by knowledge of each other's bodies and desires. Afterward, lying wrapped together against the winter cold, Victoria finally spoke the word that had been pressing against her heart for weeks. "I love you, Kade Whitmore." His arms tightened around her. "I love you too, Victoria. Think I started falling for you the moment you stepped off that train, looking scared but determined. You're the bravest person I know." "I'm not brave. I was desperate." "Desperation brought you west, but bravery kept you here. There's a difference." They talked long into the night, making plans for the future with the confidence of people who'd found something worth fighting for. They would expand the horse operation, maybe buy a few more cattle if beef prices held steady. Victoria wanted chickens beyond the 6 they currently kept, wanted a milk cow of their own instead of borrowing clover from Cade's neighbor. They talked about children in abstract terms, agreeing they should wait a year or 2 until the ranch was more established, but acknowledging they both wanted a family eventually. January brought a break in the weather, and they made the trip into Marysvale for supplies and to attend Sunday service. Preacher Morrison welcomed them warmly, noting with approval how well matched they seemed. Sally Chen, now Sally Preston after her own December wedding, invited them to dinner at the restaurant, and the 4 of them shared a meal that was surprisingly easy and pleasant. Whatever complicated feelings might have existed before had resolved into simple friendship. Frank Yang pulled Victoria aside as they were leaving, asking if she'd be interested in selling eggs and butter at the store come spring. "Fresh dairy and eggs fetch good prices, and folks trust quality. If your production is consistent, I'll buy whatever you can supply." Victoria agreed immediately, seeing an opportunity to contribute financially to the household. On the ride home, she excitedly calculated potential income, how many chickens they'd need to keep, whether they could manage 2 milk cows instead of 1. "You've got a head for business," Kate observed, looking pleased. "We'll make a proper rancher out of you yet." "I was thinking," Victoria said carefully, "that maybe we could hire someone to help come spring. Not full-time, but maybe a young man looking for work, someone who could learn the horse training from you. If we're going to expand, you can't do everything yourself." Cade considered this. "That's not a bad idea. There's a Ute boy, maybe 16, who comes around sometimes looking for odd jobs. His name is Tom Running Deer, goes by Tom mostly. Smart kid, good with animals. His family was part of the removal, but some of them drifted back to their traditional lands. I could teach him horse training, give him a trade that might serve him well." "That sounds perfect. Maybe talk to him next time he comes around." "I will." They fell into comfortable silence, the wagon creaking through snow-packed roads. The valley spread around them in shades of white and blue, beautiful in its winter severity. Victoria thought about how much had changed since September, how she'd stepped off a train into uncertainty and found instead a life richer than anything she'd imagined. The work was hard, yes, but it was hers. The isolation was real, but she had Cade. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together. Spring arrived slowly, winter releasing its grip with reluctant thaws and sudden snowstorms that teased false promises of warmth. By late March, the snow had retreated to the peaks and the valley began showing hints of green. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the horses grew restless in their corrals, ready for open pasture. Victoria threw herself into preparing the garden. Breaking ground in the plot, Cade helped her fence against deer and rabbits. She planted rows of potatoes and carrots, beans and peas, squash and tomatoes and herbs. Every seed felt like an investment in permanence, a statement that she belonged to this place now. True to his word, Cade had approached Tom Running Deer about work, and the young man had accepted eagerly. He arrived in early April, a quiet teenager with watchful eyes, and a way with the horses that impressed even Cade. Tom lived in a small cabin on neighboring land where several Ute families had quietly resettled, despite the official policy forcing them onto distant reservations. Cade paid him fair wages and taught him everything about breaking and training horses, grateful for the help and for Tom's knowledge of the land that sometimes exceeded his own. Victoria liked Tom immediately, appreciating his dry humor and his willingness to answer her questions about the native plants and animals of the region. He showed her which roots and greens were edible, how to identify tracks, where to find the best clay for sealing gaps in the log walls. In return, she made sure he ate well when he worked with them, packing extra food for him to take home to his family. As spring progressed into summer, the ranch thrived. Victoria's chickens numbered 20 now, producing more eggs than she and Cade could eat. She brought dozens into Frank Yang every week, earning money that she saved carefully in a jar hidden in the root cellar. The second milk cow, purchased with combined funds, provided enough dairy that Victoria learned to make cheese, selling that too. The garden exploded with growth, requiring hours of watering and weeding, but rewarding her labor with abundance. She canned and preserved everything she could, lining the cellar shelves with jars of tomatoes and pickles and jams. Cade praised her industry, marveling at how much she'd accomplished in less than a year. "You're a wonder," he told her one evening as they surveyed the loaded shelves. "We'll eat like kings this winter." "We'll eat like people who planned ahead," Victoria corrected, but she glowed under his praise. The horses Cade trained with Tom's help sold for good prices, word spreading about the quality of Whitmore Ranch stock. By midsummer, Cade had orders for 3 more horses to be delivered in autumn, which meant cash to invest in expanding the operation further. On a hot July evening, Victoria sat on the porch shelling peas, while Cade mended harness leather beside her. The work was meditative, their hands busy while their minds wandered. Victoria had been feeling strange for weeks, a persistent queasiness in the mornings, exhaustion that hit her like a physical weight by mid-afternoon. She'd been ignoring these symptoms, attributing them to hard work and heat, but their persistence was becoming difficult to overlook. "Cade," she said slowly, setting down the bowl of peas, "I think I might be expecting." His hands stilled on the leather. "Expecting a baby? I'm not certain, but all the signs point that direction. I've missed my monthly courses twice now, and the morning sickness is getting hard to ignore." Cade set aside his work and turned to face her fully, his expression cycling through surprise to concern to something that looked like wonder. "How do you feel about that?" "Scared," Victoria admitted. "We talked about waiting longer, and childbirth is dangerous. Women die from it. But also excited, if that makes sense. The idea of a baby, our baby, it feels right, even though the timing isn't what we planned. We'll figure it out, Kade said firmly, reaching for her hand. We'll get the doctor from Beaver to come stay when your time comes. We'll prepare everything properly. Women have babies all the time, and you're strong. We can do this. His confidence bolstered her own wavering courage. Then, I guess we're going to be parents. Kade pulled her into a tight embrace, and Victoria felt him trembling slightly. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. A baby. Our baby. God, Victoria. I never imagined when I placed that advertisement that less than a year later, I'd be sitting here with a wife I love and a child on the way. It feels like too much happiness to be real. It's real, Victoria assured him, though she felt the same disbelief. Her life had transformed so completely that sometimes she had to remind herself it wasn't a dream, that this ranch and this man and this future were truly hers. The months of pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation. Kade converted a corner of their bedroom into a nursery space, building a beautiful cradle from pine and sanding it smooth as glass. Victoria sewed tiny clothes from fabric. Frank Yang helped her order, her hands crafting gowns and blankets and diapers. Mrs. Matsuda visited from town, bringing gifts and advice, telling Victoria stories about birthing her own children that were meant to be reassuring, but sometimes had the opposite effect. Tom Running Deer brought a Ute woman named Sarah to meet them, an older lady who served as midwife for her community. She looked Victoria over with practical eyes, pronouncing her healthy and strong, likely to have an easy labor. Her confidence helped ease Victoria's fears, and they arranged for Sarah to stay at the ranch when Victoria's time came. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Victoria grew large with the child. She moved more slowly now, her balance shifted by the weight she carried. Kade became almost comically protective, insisting she rest more and work less, though Victoria refused to become completely idle. She continued her daily tasks, just pacing herself more carefully. The baby came in early November, arriving 2 weeks before Victoria's calculations, suggested but healthy and vigorous nonetheless. Labor started just before dawn, and by the time Kade had fetched Sarah, the contractions were coming hard and fast. The process was every bit as difficult and painful as Victoria had feared, hours of exhausting work that left her wrung out and desperate. But when the baby finally emerged, slippery and squalling, into Sarah's capable hands, the pain transformed instantly into overwhelming love. "A son," Sarah announced, cleaning the infant and wrapping him in the blanket Victoria had made. Strong lungs on this one. She placed the baby in Victoria's arms, and Victoria stared in wonder at the tiny face, the perfect fingers curling into fists, the dark hair plastered to his skull. Kade knelt beside the bed, his hand shaking as he touched his son's cheek. "He's beautiful," Kade whispered. "Perfect. What should we name him?" They'd discussed names, but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at her son, Victoria knew. "Caleb. It means faithful, devoted. Those are qualities I want him to carry." "Caleb Whitmore," Kade tested the name. "I like it. Caleb Reed Whitmore, with your maiden name as his middle." "Perfect," Victoria agreed, too exhausted to say more. Sarah shooed Kade out to let Victoria rest, taking the baby to give him his first bath while Victoria drifted into sleep. The weeks that followed were a fog of sleepless nights and constant feeding, the baby's demands erasing all other concerns. Victoria had never been so tired in her life, but she also marveled at the fierce love she felt for this tiny person they had created. Kade proved himself a devoted father, walking the floor with Caleb in the middle of the night when the baby wouldn't settle, changing diapers without complaint. Staring at his son with an expression of such tender wonder, it made Victoria's heart ache. Winter settled in again, but this year it felt different with a baby in the house. The routine Victoria and Kade had established was disrupted but enriched, their little family of 3 huddling together against the cold. Tom Running Deer came by periodically to check on them, bringing gifts from his family, a tiny pair of moccasins, a soft rabbit skin for the cradle, herbs that Sarah said would help Victoria's milk production. "You've built something good here," Tom told them on one visit, his normally reserved face breaking into a rare smile as he watched Caleb sleep. "Not many white folks would treat my people with the respect you've shown. We don't forget that." As Caleb grew from newborn to infant, his personality began emerging. He was a good-natured baby, quick to smile and curious about everything. He had Cade's gray eyes and Victoria's dark hair, a perfect blend of both parents. Watching Cade with their son, seeing the gentleness with which he handled the tiny body, Victoria fell in love with her husband all over again. Spring returned, bringing with it the work of planting and preparing for another year. Victoria managed to balance motherhood with ranch duties, learning to carry Caleb in a sling while collecting eggs or weeding the garden. Cade took on more of the heavy work, insisting she rest when she could, but Victoria refused to become idle. She was a rancher's wife, and a mother now, had grown into both roles through effort and determination. One evening in late May, with Caleb asleep in his cradle and the spring peepers singing outside, Victoria and Cade sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. They had been married nearly 2 years now, and Victoria could hardly remember the woman who'd stepped off the train into dust and uncertainty. "Do you ever regret it?" Cade asked quietly. "Answering my advertisement, leaving everything you knew?" Victoria considered the question seriously, not wanting to give a glib answer. "Some days are hard," she said finally. "When the work seems endless, or I'm too tired to think straight, or winter makes me feel trapped. But regret? No. This life we've built, it's mine in a way nothing ever was before. I chose it, I worked for it, and now I can't imagine being anywhere else." "Good," Cade said, relief evident in his voice. "Because I can't imagine this life without you anymore. You've made me happier than I knew was possible." "Same," Victoria said simply, reaching for his hand. They sat in comfortable silence, their joined hands resting between them, a physical manifestation of the partnership they had forged. The years unfolded with the rhythm of ranch life, seasons cycling through their predictable patterns. Caleb grew into a sturdy toddler, then a bright child, helping with small tasks around the ranch with the seriousness children bring to such responsibilities. When he was 3, Victoria became pregnant again, and this time a daughter arrived in early spring, a tiny girl they named Eleanor, who had her father's quiet temperament and her mother's determination. The ranch prospered as Cade's reputation for quality horses spread throughout Utah and into neighboring territories. Tom Running Deer became a full partner in the training operation, his skills complementing Cade's, and together they commanded premium prices for their stock. Victoria's egg and dairy business grew until Frank Young was buying everything she could produce, and other stores in nearby towns began requesting her products. They built a proper addition onto the house, expanding the bedroom space to accommodate the growing family. Cade hired help to build a new barn, twice the size of the old one, with proper stalls and a loft for storing hay. The ranch that had been barely surviving when Victoria arrived was now thriving, visible evidence of what partnership and hard work could achieve. On Caleb's 5th birthday, they threw a party and invited neighbors from throughout the valley. The Matsudas came from town, Frank Yang brought gifts, Tom Running Deer arrived with his family, including his new wife, a young Ute woman named Mary. Sally and Samuel Preston came with their infant daughter. The house rang with laughter and conversation, children racing around the yard while adults talked and ate Victoria's cooking. Standing in the midst of this celebration, watching Cade toss Caleb into the air, while Eleanor clung to his leg, demanding her turn, Victoria felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. This community, these relationships, this life she'd built it all from nothing but courage and hope. As the party wound down and guests departed, as the sun set behind the mountains painting the sky in shades of fire, Victoria stood on the porch with Cade's arm around her waist. The children were exhausted and sleeping. The house was a mess that could wait until tomorrow, and everything felt exactly as it should be. "Happy?" Cade asked, though he knew the answer. "Impossibly happy," Victoria confirmed. "Sometimes I think about that day at the train station, how scared I was, how uncertain. I couldn't have imagined this future if I'd tried. That makes 2 of us. I was hoping for a work partner and maybe some companionship. Instead, I got you a woman who challenges me and supports me and loves me, who gave me children and helped build this ranch into something remarkable. You're my greatest blessing, Victoria Whitmore." She turned in his arms to kiss him properly, putting into the gesture all the love and gratitude and contentment she felt. When they finally parted, both smiling, Victoria rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady as always. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as the first time she'd spoken them on that snowy Christmas Eve. "I love you too, always." They stood together watching the stars emerge, the same stars that had guided Victoria west 2 years ago, and she silently thanked whatever providence had brought her to this place, to this man, to this life that had exceeded every dream she'd dared to dream. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes both large and small. Caleb started school in Marysvale, riding into town 3 times a week with other ranch children, his bright mind soaking up knowledge. Eleanor grew into a spirited girl who preferred helping her father with horses over any domestic task, and Victoria let her follow her interests rather than forcing her into traditional feminine roles. When Victoria was 30, she gave birth to a 3rd child, another boy they named Matthew, who arrived during a thunderstorm that shook the house. This baby was more demanding than his siblings had been, colicky and restless, but by now, Victoria was experienced enough to weather the difficult newborn phase with relative calm. The ranch continued expanding, more land purchased from a neighbor who decided to return east, more horses bred and trained, more cattle grazing the expanded pastures. Tom Running Deer brought his younger brother into the business, teaching him as Kade had taught Tom. The operation grew large enough that they built a second cabin for the workers, creating a small compound where several families now lived and worked together. Kade and Victoria became respected pillars of the Marysvale community, known for their fair dealing and their willingness to help neighbors in need. When drought struck in the summer of Victoria's 32nd year, they opened their creek to neighboring ranchers whose water sources had failed. When a family lost their home to fire, Kade and Victoria organized a barn raising, bringing the community together to rebuild. Through it all, their partnership remained the foundation of everything they built. They still made major decisions together, still divided the work according to their strengths, still found time at the end of long days to sit together and talk. The passionate intensity of early love had mellowed into something deeper and more resilient, a partnership tested by hardship and proven strong. On their 10th anniversary, Kade surprised Victoria with a trip to Salt Lake City, leaving the children with Mrs. Matsuda for 3 days while they traveled north. It was the first time Victoria had been away from the ranch in years, and the city overwhelmed her with its noise and crowds. But sharing it with Kade, exploring together and staying in a proper hotel with indoor plumbing and electric lights felt like an adventure. They bought gifts for the children and new clothes for themselves, indulging in small luxuries they usually denied. On the train ride home, watching Utah Territory roll past the windows, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 10 years since she'd stepped off a train into dust and uncertainty. 10 years of hard work and gradual transformation, of love discovered and family built. She was 43 now, no longer young but strong and healthy. Her hands calloused from labor, but her spirit at peace. "What are you thinking about?" Kade asked, noticing her abstraction. "How much I've changed since coming here. How much we've changed. I was so scared that first day, worried I'd made a terrible mistake. Now, I can't imagine any other life. You weren't the only one scared. I was terrified you'd take one look at the ranch and decide it wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough. When you stayed, when you chose to really build a life with me instead of just enduring it, that's when I knew we'd make something good together. We made something better than good. We made something extraordinary." Kade smiled, reaching for her hand. "That we did, Mrs. Whitmore. That we did." They returned to find the children had thrived in their absence, Caleb having taken charge of his siblings with a responsibility beyond his 10 years. Eleanor proudly showed them a horse she'd been training, demonstrating skills her father had taught her. Matthew, at 3, mostly just demanded attention and treats from the city. Life returned to its familiar rhythms, the seasons turning through their cycles. Victoria watched her children grow, saw Caleb develop a love of books that reminded her of herself, saw Eleanor's confidence with animals exceed even her father's, saw Matthew's sunny disposition win hearts throughout the valley. She taught them what she knew, shared stories of Philadelphia so they'd understand where she'd come from, instilled in them values of hard work and fairness and compassion. When Caleb turned 18, he announced his intention to attend the university in Salt Lake City, wanting to study agriculture and business. Kade and Victoria supported the decision, proud that their son had ambitions beyond the ranch even as they'd miss his presence. Eleanor, now 15, had no interest in leaving, declaring her intention to run the horse operation when her father retired. "She's got better instincts with horses than I ever did," Kate admitted to Victoria one evening after Eleanor had successfully gentled a skittish mare no one else could approach. "The business will be in good hands when she takes over." "If she takes over," Victoria corrected. "She's young yet, might change her mind. And there's Matthew to consider too. We don't know what his interests will be." "Fair point. But I like knowing the ranch will continue, that what we built won't die with us. We've created something that can outlast us, something that can provide for generations." Victoria understood his pride, felt it herself when she looked at what they'd accomplished. The ranch now employed 6 people full-time, provided income for several families, stood as proof that hard work and partnership could overcome almost any obstacle. It was a legacy worth leaving. As Victoria approached her 50th birthday, she found herself reflecting more on gratitude than on regrets. Her body showed the wear of hard-living hands rough from work, face weathered from sun and wind, hair showing its first silver strands. But she wore these marks proudly, evidence of a life lived fully rather than merely endured. Kade had aged too, his dark hair now more gray than not, his face lined from years of weather and worry. But he was still strong, still capable of full days of hard work, still the quiet, steady presence he'd been when she first met him. Looking at him still made her heart quicken, 20 years of marriage having not dimmed her love, but deepened it. On a golden afternoon in September, 20 years almost to the day since Victoria had stepped off that train, they rode together up into the high country, where the aspen groves had turned brilliant yellow. The children were all occupied with their own tasks, and Kade had insisted they take a few hours away from the endless demands of the ranch. They dismounted near a meadow overlooking the valley, their valley, spread below them in patchwork patterns of fields and forest. From this height, they could see the ranch buildings tiny in the distance, could trace the silver line of the creek, could identify neighboring homesteads scattered across the landscape. "Remember when you first arrived?" Kade asked, his arm around Victoria's waist as they surveyed the view. "You said the valley was beautiful, but I could tell you were scared." "I was terrified," Victoria admitted. "Everything was so different, so foreign. I didn't know if I could survive here, let alone thrive. But you made me feel safe from that first moment, when our eyes met across the platform. Your eyes promised shelter, and you've kept that promise every day since. You gave me as much shelter as I gave you. Shelter from loneliness, from despair, from the slow erosion of living without purpose. You made this ranch come alive again, filled it with laughter and love and meaning. I'm the lucky one in this arrangement, Victoria. Never doubt that." She turned to face him, cupping his weathered face in her calloused hands. "We're both lucky. We found each other at exactly the right moment, when we both needed saving in our different ways, and we built something beautiful together." Kade kissed her then, gentle and sweet, a kiss of affection and appreciation rather than passion. When they parted, both smiling, Victoria felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived, of promises kept and dreams exceeded. They stood together watching the sun descend toward the mountains, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Below them, smoke rose from the ranch house chimney, where Matthew was surely starting supper preparations. Eleanor would be finishing evening chores, and Caleb would be home from university soon for fall break. Their family was healthy, their ranch was prospering, their community was strong. "Shall we head back?" Kade asked as the light began fading. "In a moment," Victoria said, wanting to hold on to this perfect instant a bit longer. "Let me just appreciate this view, this life, this gift of 20 years with you." Kade tightened his arm around her, and they stood together in companionable silence as darkness gathered in the valley below and stars began emerging overhead. Finally, as full night approached, they mounted their horses and began the descent toward home, toward the lights glowing warm in their windows, toward the life they had built through courage and love and determination. The ranch welcomed them back with familiar comfort, Matthew rushing out to take their horses, Eleanor calling that supper was ready, the house filled with warmth and light and the sounds of family. Victoria and Kade entered together as they'd done everything for 20 years, partners in all things, and Victoria knew that whatever years remained to them would be lived with the same grace and gratitude that had marked all their time together. That night, lying in bed with Kade's breathing slow and steady beside her, Victoria thought back to that frightened young woman stepping off the train, clutching a carpet bag containing all her worldly possessions. She'd come west looking for survival and found instead a home, looking for shelter and found instead love, looking for a future and found instead a legacy. The dust of that September platform had settled long ago, but the promise she'd seen in a cowboy's quiet eyes had proven true beyond all expectations, had carried her through 20 years of hardship and triumph to this moment of perfect contentment. She closed her eyes and slept deeply, securely, in the home she'd claimed and the life she'd built, surrounded by the family she'd created, with a man who'd offered her shelter and received the same in return. Outside, the Utah night wrapped around the ranch in its familiar embrace, and the mountains stood eternal witness to the love story that had unfolded in their shadow, a story of two lonely souls finding each other and forging something unbreakable from nothing but hope and determination and the courage to choose partnership over isolation. And in the morning, they would wake and do it all again, building their life day by day, exactly as they'd been doing for 20 years, exactly as they would continue doing for however many years remained to them, together always in the shelter of their love.